In a change of pace, tonight I wanted to do something that I'll call a spiritual biography, and try to do this without doxing myself. I've spent all of my life living south of the Mason-Dixon line. I don't know how much of that is evident from how I talk or the things I talk about. But I have certainly lived closer to that border at some times than at others. And religion changes dramatically the further you go south. And if you go up far north, even within the South, you can encounter elements of New England revivalism. And that exists primarily as vestiges within certain denominations. So, for instance, the Congregationalist Church, or as it was when I attended it, the Evangelical Congregationalist Church, is very much a revivalistic branch commensurate with Methodism. So much so that when they were on better terms, they even shared seminaries, those two denominations. And that's the Christianity that I grew up with, however flawed and narrow-minded, and caught up in the zeitgeist of Billy Graham revivalism, Billy Graham big name, big tent evangelicalism. That was where I was introduced to a basic theology, basic worldview, basic morality, and the stories of Christianity, the stories of the Old and New Testament. And I will say that it was not the worst thing to ever happen to me. But if you have an analytical mind, a systematic mind, if you're on the spectrum, you will absorb belief systems as structures, and you'll absorb them and turn them into a metaphysic. And everyone has a metaphysic. Everyone has a mental map, or they've arranged their mind, their mental house with all sorts of furniture, such that even walking around blind, you can feel your way around, and when you sit down, you know you're going to land on something soft. Most people never have to question it because they're not thinking about it too hard. They don't let incongruities or inconsistencies destroy their metaphysic. Not many people can be moved from the faith of their fathers or the faith of their youth. So, the Evangelical Church, much like Methodism in its heyday, relied on revivalism as the means of conversion. And what do I mean by revivalism? Basically, the traveling evangelist, that style of preaching, the anxious bench, the prayer card, the sinner's prayer, the hellfire and brimstone preaching to elicit fear in the hearer and a response, because after all, this is the only way that we get to measure the success of the preacher. So I guess it's intoxicating for the preacher. And some people are just addicted to this type of anxiety. I would have done anything to rid myself from that anxiety, especially given the vividness with which hell was described. And then, whereas in prior generations, you might expect to live to old age if nothing took you out prematurely, but my generation was awash in the rapture mania. And I have a word for this now, and I catch the boomers still doing it. I call them rapture-gasms. The boomers, nobody's more ready to leave here than the boomers. They're like, you ready for the rapture? And they think gosh, it was a theology custom tailored for a generation who believed that when they close their eyes on this world, it literally ceases to exist. That their generation gets to be the last generation to grow up and enjoy life. And then God's going to snap his fingers like Thanos and just yank everybody out of this world if you're lucky. So the anxiety was coming from two different directions. One's ultimate demise and the hereafter, but then also the cosmic boogeyman, which could just appear at any moment, split the sky open and grab all your friends and family and leave you here with the Antichrist. Goodness gracious, so many of the youth were lost out of this movement. Why? Because who can sustain this level of mental anguish year after year after year after year? And, the solution was, well, just make sure you're going to heaven by praying this little prayer. Except, how many people did we see pray the prayer and then go off either to leave religion altogether or to live a life of absolute debasement? So we knew the prayer wasn't going to save anyone. Whether or not the prayer, quote-unquote, took is what saved you. And then this was supposed to be evidenced by some interior light. Some of us cannot even fake these experiences. And I watch people psych themselves up and psych themselves out to try to have some sort of burning in the bosom. And for some people it works. And this is as good as receiving the golden tablets or a voice from heaven. And then they get to live with assurance until the day they die. And for the rest of us, particularly those not so easily fooled, or I guess prone to believing in negative outcomes, none of this was good enough. None of this was going to cut it. After a family move, we moved further and deeper into the South, where there were no evangelical churches. I'm using that in the narrow sense. Evangelical Congregationalist churches. There were none. And the closest you could get to evangelicalism at the time was fundamentalism, which was, you could say, the granddaddy of evangelicalism was fundamentalism. Billy Graham, when he started out life as a Christian, was probably a fundamentalist, and then he birthed the modern evangelical movement probably in the 50s. If you step back in time, beyond that, fundamentalism existed probably from the late 19th into the middle of the 20th century as the brand of conservative Christianity. And it infested everything from Baptists to Methodists, even to some Presbyterians could be labeled as fundamentalist. No Lutherans practically, certainly no Anglicans or Episcopalians. But this is where you discover what the song was talking about when it sang about the old time religion. And this was revivalism coupled with a blind trust in the naked words of the King James Bible, and a certain fanaticism, a certain assurance founded upon nothing but circular reasoning. And it also was coupled with this desire to uphold social norms, and so things like rock music was out, things like short skirts, anything but a dress on a woman or anything but a long skirt on a woman was considered a sign of rebellion. Go back far enough in time, they would even condemn dancing and going to movies. And these people chilled out. Generation by generation, they became more permissive, but generally the fundamentalists were against the most recent thing. I remember sitting through sermons in a Baptist church where the preacher railed against Pokemon cards. I kid you not. That took up a lot of time. Railing against Pokemon cards, the Pokemon video game, and the Pokemon television series. To go line by line through the theme song and to equate Pokemon to dabbling in witchcraft. Things like that, and boycotting Disney and boycotting McDonald's, and it's just you make the long list of things that they stood for while being some of the most wretched people you'd ever know. Righteousness to them was about the stances that you took, not about the person that you were. So fundamentalism kind of made me twofold more the child of hell than I ever was before, because the only way to prove your mettle, so to speak, the only way to demonstrate that you are serious about the faith is within that frame of reference to be as extreme as possible. All right, we're not watching Disney films. No, sir, we're not watching any films. Television is out of the house, that sort of thing. Is that a New King James Bible I see in your hand? That's not welcome here. This is a King James only space. So it was during this time that I read the Bible maybe about 9 or 10 times through. And I have a pretty good memory. When I was younger, it was probably bordering on photographic. That is, I would remember not just what the text said, I would remember the page that it was on, where it was on the page, and roughly where in the book that page was, so that looking things up again to cross-reference wasn't hard at all. And when you read the Bible through in short periods of time, let's say 3 months, I think. Reading the whole Bible through, I think in 3 months, that was my personal record. I read it through 4 times in 1 year, one time. When you can do that and also remember what it said from beginning to end, you begin to see the seams. That is, where it's stitched together, where it doesn't really congeal very well. But also you see certain themes that crop up that were otherwise easy to ignore. Like if you only read Romans 9 once or twice in your life, you might easily ignore this subtext in Paul about predestination. But if you're reading it several times a year and you remember pretty much his entire argument, it becomes really hard to avoid the power of certain arguments towards Calvinism. And there is a Calvinist stream within the Baptist, you could say, paradigm. There is a Calvinist stream. It actually runs pretty strong and has a long history. I think some of the first Baptists, if we don't count the Anabaptists and we don't count the Amish or the Mennonites, if we count actual Baptists, which come from John Smith, I think he was exiled to Holland at the time. He was a Puritan, and he baptized his whole congregation by immersion, I think in the 1600s. This is where you get modern Baptists from, and from the beginning, they were all Calvinists. So the Calvinist stream in the Baptist church goes all the way back to the beginning. So if you start by reading the Bible to come to certain Calvinist leanings, it's really easy to find a particular Baptist church, and a particular Baptist church is the same as a Calvinistic Baptist church. Pretty easy to find. Any major city should have one. A lot of small towns have them. And if you can stomach it, then, barring the Baptist option, if you can stomach it, then you just go to a PCA church. Stands for Presbyterian Church of America. They baptize babies, so a lot of Baptists would never consider that, but the more you read the Bible and you see certain themes, for instance, covenant signs, and the idea that those born into the covenant receive the sign immediately, such as baptism. Such as circumcision. Baptism becomes the analog for circumcision, and is therefore applied at birth, or near thereto. There is a certain internal consistency in Calvinism that's really hard to. I guess, relinquish. That for those trying to systematize Christianity, Calvinism offers that system, and it's utterly internally consistent. So it's really appealing. There are many people who will absolutely shred the scriptures so that they can keep their Calvinism. I was not willing to do that, and so I was, I guess, an early adopter of Calvinism during the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement. And I held on to it for as long as the scriptures would permit it. But as I read the New Testament more, it's not that I saw Calvinism less, it's just that I saw contradictions to it, even though it made the scriptures incoherent. So Paul said that that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And then there were times when, was it Peter or Jude was talking about those reprobates that essentially trampled upon the Christ that died for them and rejected him. That doesn't square with Calvinism, because ultimately, if anyone's damned, that Christ never died for them. And yet the Bible says that the wandering stars, for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever, they in fact were paid for by Christ in his sacrifice. And so there are many scriptures that simply will not permit the particulars of Calvinism to exist. The scriptures are the death knell. They are the kryptonite. They are the silver bullet against Calvinism. And the Calvinists will simply point to one half of the scriptures which support their view, and then ignore the other half of the scriptures which do not support their view. But to take the scriptures seriously, you'd pretty much have to hold these things in tandem and in balance, not ignoring anything, but understanding that there's a tension, even if the tension on its face creates an inconsistency or a contradiction. And so that's why I fell immediately from Calvinism into Lutheranism, because Lutheranism has this tradition, probably stemming from Luther, probably stemming from their law-gospel distinction, that they hold the plain truths of Scripture in tension deliberately, and they don't try to solve the tension, because you can't. You can't without slaying one half of the Scriptures or excising it from your purview. So I started reading Luther. I read Bondage of the Will. And it's easy to move from Calvinism to Lutheranism, because you realize that Luther's predestination isn't radically different from Calvin's. Luther just permits more mystery, you could say. Even up to and including the sacraments, which for Luther are not radically different than the Catholic sacraments. They are effectual. For instance, in baptism, Christ is truly present in the Eucharist, vis-a-vis transubstantiation, although that's not how the Lutherans would put it. Lutheranism was an easy fit, and I probably would have stayed there if it wasn't for reading more and more of Luther. Read the Catechism, Lutheran Catechism, and then the Book of Concord. Now, I understand that Luther did not write the entire Book of Concord, but it's hard to imagine that anything ended up in the Book of Concord that he would disagree with wholeheartedly. And it basically said, and I believe this may have even been Luther's writing, Luther admitted that the Bishop of Rome was a true bishop, and that he would be glad to acknowledge the true Bishop of Rome, were he simply to abandon his errors concerning soteriology, etc., etc. And what I discovered was that, I think it was sometime in the 90s, there was this joint declaration between Lutherans and Roman Catholics about soteriology, that is, salvation, that they ultimately said that the differences between Catholicism and Lutheranism on salvation were purely rhetorical. And what I gathered from this was that the Reformation, what it attempted to fix, what it attempted to address, was largely over and had been over for some time. But because, there are too many people, thousands, millions of people heavily invested in not just Lutheranism, but Protestantism more broadly, who have paid for their education, who have paid for their buildings, who have their own communities, who would not wish to be a part of the Church of Rome whatsoever. They have their own traditions, their own modes of worship, their own songs. Even if the Reformation were to end on the terms established by the early reformers, there would be and could be no reconciliation for the reasons listed. I realized that the Reformation was kind of a farce because it had no finish line in mind. It was like kind of like communism, like the revolution is eternal. You know, the revolution never ends. You're always rebelling against something. Even when the communists come to full power, they're still arresting people and executing them for anti-revolutionary behaviors and activities. You know, still pretending, even though they're in positions of power and authority, that they're the persecuted underclass. It's absurd. It's self-delusional. And I just find that Reformation Protestantism is self-delusional. That if they believed or knew anything about their origins, they would realize that the Catholic Church has made many of the changes suggested to them back in the 1600s or the 1500s. It is not the same organization, and so if there was any time to call an end to the Reformation, it was like right now. And so I became Roman Catholic. And, you know, after my belief system more or less collapsed when I was a teenager, and you lose the metaphysic, all right, that is, there are certain assumptions that everyone makes when they wake up in the morning that cannot be proven by anything, cannot be proven to exist. It's the reification of all that you assume. That for me was gone, all right? That for me, I lost that. And I had been trying to search and find a replacement ever since, and I thought I had found it in Calvinism until I saw all the seams, that is, where things are just stitched together. It was a hatchet job, you know, to put it together, contrary to all Scripture. Lutheranism seemed to do a better job, but then it admitted its own defeat in its own Book of Concord. You know, there was no finish line for Lutheranism. Lutheranism was a rebellion against who knows what. Nobody knew. It sufficed for most people to continue to call the Pope the Antichrist. You know, nobody was really thinking about it in the way that Luther would have intended. So Lutheranism was self-defeating. It did not provide a satisfying metaphysic. It was not intellectual enough. As a matter of fact, even to this day, I think this is why Lutherans in general irk me so bad. They are the most anti-intellectual cohort I have ever met that called themselves Christian. I could make more sense of the Amish or the Mennonites or the fucking Pentecostals before I could make sense of a Lutheran. Lutherans butcher language, and maybe this stems from their spiritual father Luther. Luther butchered language, and he inserted the word alone in, was it Romans chapter 4. He famously called James the epistle of straw. Why? Because, on its face it contradicted his soteriology. So I don't find the Lutherans, and never did, at least not for very long, find the Lutherans intellectually honest. And therefore, they could never gift me a proper metaphysic. That is, a system of thought complete with its most basic first principles and assumptions from which I could then found a life. As I joined Roman Catholicism, what I encountered was a fully incarnate faith. This is a faith that you could live every moment of your day. Probably because it had a continuity going back 2,000 years, and about everything that could be thought about from the lens of Catholicism had already been thought about, written about, and in more than a few instances decreed upon from either some bishopric or the catechism or some papal documents. Everything seemed to have an answer. Whatever your problem, it seemed to have an answer. Now, some of the answers are absolutely grotesque and abhorrent and monstrous and ghastly, but they have an answer. And so that appealed to me. It appealed to me that the most intellectually rigorous theology comes from Aquinas, who is, sits at the feet of Aristotle. and uses language and terminology that I understood as a Latin scholar, and seemed to have a seriousness about it. Its adherents seemed to truly understand what it meant to suffer and to sacrifice, and the priesthood. You had to be serious enough about the priesthood to forego marriage and family. And on its face, it looked like everything I needed. And so I pursued it wholeheartedly, became a convert, attempted to live the life, and what I discovered is that the grace that it promises simply is not there. It's a cloud that carries no rain. But I'm not bad-mouthing Catholicism when I say that, because every iteration, every permutation of Christianity I had encountered and adopted and pursued up to this point had also been a rainless cloud. It had also been an empty promise. As Jung said, he said, Christ came to redeem the world, and yet none of us feels redeemed. What's up with that? The grace that I was supposed to receive through the sacraments, because I assumed that my life, my personal life, my thought life, my lack of holiness was due to the fact that up till this point I had not ever received proper sacraments from a proper priest. And then even after receiving these things, nothing interiorly, nothing internally, nothing within my soul changed. I guess I despaired, but not yet. I applied myself. I doubled my efforts, and I figured, well, if there's a failure, it's my failure. I doubled my efforts, and I became scrupulous, overly so. Put a lot of stress on my family, you could say, to attempt to do family devotions, a family rosary, get to church, get to Mass every single week, come hell or high water. To try to impose fasting within the household. All those things the trad Catholics will tell you are good, right, and even easy to do, because the Lord will grant you the grace to do these things. And what I discovered is that it's a tremendous burden, and the trads would have you believe that, if you go back just 70 or 80 years, every Catholic was doing everything the church demanded of them. The truth is that for the vast majority of church history, very few Catholics ever ascended to even the bare minimum of standards set by the church. Whether it was personal conduct or church attendance or knowledge of Scripture or knowledge of the Catechism, everyone was falling short all the time, all over the world. And what I discovered by following the trads, both online and in my personal life, is that they are beyond fucked up, like in the head. It takes a certain kind of person to become that rigorous to begin with, but also because almost no one can naturally perform the tasks required by the church, it creates a lot of hypocrisy. And so you're either a lunatic or a hypocrite or both. When you go to a traditional Latin Mass, you'll find hipsters that really enjoy the Latin. You'll find hypocrites that have a double life that they'll probably will be in the 8 o'clock news within 10 or 15 years. Then you have people who are really struggling, have to go to confession all the damn time because they're constantly failing in their marriages, in their personal lives, towards their children and their job. They're constantly failing, and they know it, and they always feel like shit, and they're probably drinking themselves to death because they always feel like shit. Those are the people you're going to meet at Latin Mass. That and conspiracy theorists. Now, I don't mean like my version of conspiracy theorists. I mean like orders of magnitude worse. Like people who believe things that have no basis in reality, never did, but it's usually some gratuitous belief that serves the idea that the church is somehow in its Babylonian exile and will be saved by Prester John or some shit. those are the people you'll find in Latin Mass. Those are the trads. They're all crazy. They're all lunatics. They're all hypocrites, and they're not succeeding. The church isn't going to magically go back to what it was 100 years ago. It probably shouldn't. All right, moving on. Disillusionment, particularly with orthodoxy, because in all these iterations, I was attempting to be a version of orthodox, and everybody's orthodoxy is different. You can't really be satisfied with where you land with either your personal beliefs, your personal metaphysic, your own system of morality. You can't be satisfied with it until you are unchained, unmoored from the demands of orthodoxy, because the demands of orthodoxy are insane. The stuff you have to believe without any evidence and contrary to all logic, whatever the system you happen to choose, it's all got its absurdities built into it, baked into it from the beginning. The only true freedom you'll have is in free thought. Getting away from orthodoxy of any type, forming your own opinions, even forming your own morality, your own moral code. That's where you'll be happy, but all my prior training had forced me to be very fearful. Once you leave orthodoxy, you're practically damning yourself. You are rushing headlong into the furnace. And so in order to explore unorthodox positions, you have to first lose your fear of judgment. And I guess what finally did it for me was the idea that I had asked God for years and years and years for guidance, for strength, for conviction, for interior, light. To be what He asked me to be. And the help never came. I mean, literally, never, ever has that prayer been answered in my life, ever. And I just said to myself, it would be a very strange God indeed. For the first time He notices me. The first time in my life he looks upon me and takes note is to damn me. And I basically said to myself, the God that cannot save also cannot damn. And that was my first little act of interior rebellion. And I just followed my intuition as I continued to read the scriptures, as I continued to research history, particularly the history of the Old Testament religion, the early church, certain of its doctrines, followed my intuition, followed my conscience. And what I discovered by reading and studying is that the entire thing is a confection. That is, it is synthetic. It's made out of spare parts that were lying around in late antiquity. Out of the destruction of all existing belief systems in late antiquity. What happened in late antiquity? You have you could say the mass disillusionment with pagan religion and the skepticism that was injected into the Roman Empire by its absorption of the Greeks. The Greeks had become notorious skeptics by this point, virtual atheists. And the importation of Eastern faiths in that vacuum, like Mithraism, Manichaeism, and the persistence of the Jewish faith even after the destruction of the temple, and the destruction of the temple gave an opportunity to, rebrand what it meant to be Jewish. And in that melting pot, and I say it's spare parts, it's like all existing belief systems were simply fed into a wood chipper. Out of that melting pot, out of all the spare parts just lying around on the ground, Christianity is cobbled together, and I can point to elements of it that come from all of the prior pre-existing belief systems and structures and priesthoods and temples that already inhabited the entire Mediterranean at the time. And to top it all off, the Jews, at least until Josiah, were not even monotheistic. They were polytheists. Saul was a straight pagan. He named at least one, maybe two, if I remember correctly, two of his sons after Baal. David, when he lived in Saul's palace, he escaped notice. He jumped out of a window and then claimed, his wife at the time, Michal, I think, claimed he was sick, and really she had just taken an idol, laid it sideways in the bed, covered it up, put some goat hair just above the pillow, and it looked like a body. That was a pretty massive idol. I'll bet you it wasn't Yahweh that they were worshiping. I'll bet you it was probably an Asherah pole, as they used to worship, or possibly an obelisk for Baal. These images that we hear in the Old Testament around the time of David, these are not permitted by Moses, and so it should be obvious they're not worshiping Yahweh. Right? They're not even pretending to. David named a David named a battlefield after Baal. You can look that up. I want to say it was Baal Peor. I could be wrong about that. David named a battlefield after Baal. Solomon, the scriptures state plainly he worshipped foreign gods, and he burned his children to Moloch. So the early one of David's sons was, and this was, I think he was the direct opposition to the ascension of Solomon to the throne. I think his name was Adonijam. Adonijam, you would have pronounced it Adonijam. Yam was the Ugaritic sea god. Adonijam, or Adonijam, means Yam is Lord. Not Yah, not Jehovah, Yam. So the Old Testament is pretty rife with evidence that it was no different than any other Canaanite cult of the area, of the time. It was not radically different than the Ugaritic cult to the north. Wasn't radically different to the Chemosh or the Chemosh cult to the south. It was really just the Jewish version of every other cult in the area. Had its own pantheon. Jehovah had a wife. Yahweh or Jehovah was simply one of the sons of El. There was a higher God than Yahweh. Yahweh was simply the most immanent God. He was a national God. He was not the father of creation. That comes later. So I'm off on a tangent, but you see what I'm saying, that once you go digging in the foundations, you don't even find a solid foundation anywhere. It's not like if you dig deep enough, you'll find bedrock, and you say, well, here, I can build on this. No. The deeper you dig, the more rubble you find, and you find that it's more like an ancient tell. Tell means hill. It's like an ancient hill fort or a hill civilization or a hill city, that it's a hill for a reason. It's been burned down and destroyed multiple times, and every time somebody built on the rubble, such that now what was probably begun on a plain, the city is now built on top of a hill, because it's built on the destruction of all that came before. So Christianity is built on the rubble that was Hebrew polytheism, or Canaanite polytheism, which becomes monotheism probably under Josiah, becomes universal monotheism through Persian influence during the Babylonian exile, and this is carried over into Christianity, strengthened further by the monotheism of Plato, the monad. And so Christianity ends up as this amalgamation of very late Jewish monotheism, Plato, and certain trappings of Mithraism. And there's no other way of understanding this. There's no other way of understanding early Christianity. Its priesthood, its practices, its communal meals, than to say that it was born out of the detritus, the debris field of the wreck of late antiquity. It is what Spangler would have called the second religiousness. That is, after the empire had pretty much abandoned everything that it had known of religion, the only thing it had left was Christianity or possibly Mithraism, but Mithraism was understood as some sort of Persian interlocutor, and so Christianity was decided upon officially as an imperial expedient, and then subsumed every other belief system. By the time of, I think it was Theodosius, Christianity is the only legal religion in the empire. Everyone has to funnel into it. So what do they bring into it? They bring their paganism. They bring their idols. They bring their images. They bring their devotion to the lesser gods, which become the saints. All right. And so everything within Christianity is explainable by pointing to some predecessor which is not Christian or even monotheistic, but rather pagan. So Christianity is, as I've put it before, it's the sum of all prior belief. It's the sum of all pagan hopes and pagan fears, congealed under the aegis of one God and his host of angels. And it comes complete with a soteriology. It answers all the right questions. It comes complete with an explanation of why we're so fucked up. Comes complete with an explanation about how we get fixed. Comes with an explanation of where we're all going. All right? Are we just marching into a void? Of course not. We're either marching to heaven or hell. And now your conduct here will determine where you go. So as a means of propagating empire, seeing it through another century or so, it did exactly what it was intended to do. But the thing is that in such a vacuum, and without anything else to replace it, it becomes normative. And it became normative for the next 1,000 years. Nobody thought to question it until, modern academia, in which case the Bible was studied scientifically and was found to be wanting. And so the Christian adherence to truth finally slew the Bible itself, which became a huge problem post-Reformation because the Bible was held up as the only thing you could trust, and yet you couldn't trust it. So what did I finally land upon? Because I'm still here, I still function. I still sought after a metaphysic even after I was disillusioned with Catholicism. And the answer is that now I'm pretty much a Gnostic. Not an agnostic, that's something different. A Gnostic. Gnostic comes from the word Gnosis, which means knowledge. I believe in the pursuit of knowledge and not to adhere to a preconceived orthodoxy, but the pursuit of knowledge to build my own metaphysic based on logic, experience, and evidence. And I feel so comfortable with this, I could almost be an evangelist for it, except that it's kind of something you have to work your way into. You can't just be handed such a system. Most people, orthodoxy exists for most people because most people, you give them this much freedom intellectually, they start to go crazy. They don't know where to go. They have nowhere to land. They're not comfortable making these determinations for themselves. They need to be told what to believe. And so what I discovered was that orthodoxy is for the masses. Orthodoxy has to exist. All right, and even after Christianity ceases to be the common orthodoxy, what does the secularist use as the common orthodoxy? He says, we believe the science. Yeah, a lot of people took a lot of really nasty, nasty medication in the past several years because they trusted the science, but that's their metaphysic. They have no other metaphysic to land upon, and so they have to trust the science. What else would they trust? Their own fucking opinion? Most people do not trust their own opinions. That's why they cling to the opinions they've been handed. Very little original thought. And so Gnosticism, why did I land on Gnosticism? The Bible actually does seem to support this. Like I said, El had 70 sons. If there's any truth to that at all, El is probably an alien, like the Mormons think. Or maybe not exactly like the Mormons, but El is some sort of extraterrestrial being. Perhaps he is very godlike. But the nations of the world seem to be governed by lesser beings, and these would be his sons. And the Gnostics would call these archons. And the rise and fall of empires and various wars and conflicts and the fact that this whole place seems to be one big loosh farm, one big prison, leads me to believe that we actually are governed over by some sort of very malevolent spiritual force. I'm very comfortable calling those the archons. I'm very comfortable calling Jehovah the chief archon, because as I continued to read the Bible, and I kept hearing this talk about the synagogue of Satan and how the Jews were blinded by the god of this world. Well, why would their God, if they worship the true God, let the god of, quote, this world blind their eyes? And what I discovered is that the only way the Jews could be blinded by the god of this world is if they were serving him. And now, like, everything just clicked together, like Legos. It just clicked, like a big puzzle. All the pieces. The farther I got into this puzzle, the faster the pieces kept clicking and going together until finally the picture was in front of me. That there is a God of this world. He's very imminent. But to serve him is to serve chaos. And he has a chosen people, but I wouldn't want to be one of his chosen people. I wouldn't want the karmic debt. When they're called the synagogue of Satan, that's pretty accurate. The god of this world is the devil. And like Israel Anderson, who's another researcher on this front, he makes a strong case that Yahweh is actually the devil. Jehovah is Satan. And, by extension, Jesus would be like Prometheus or Lucifer. Now, wrap your head around that one. But see, there's scriptures for that too, because Lucifer, Lucisferor, is the name for Venus, which is the morning star. What is Jesus called? He's called the bright and morning star. So, like, there are scriptures that far better support Gnosticism than anything that orthodoxy would suggest. I found that the strongest case, the very strongest case for a belief system to be made from the Bible itself is Gnosticism. And that's when I made the switch. I mean, I had to lose my fear of judgment and start using my brain, which was terrifying at first. But this is where I landed. A few more pieces of evidence before I close. How do we know that Jesus was a Gnostic? If you're going to follow Jesus and call yourself a Gnostic, it would be nice to know that Jesus himself was a Gnostic. Well, read the Gospel of John. What does he say to the Jews? He said, "You are of your father the devil." Why are the Jews of their father the devil? Did they openly worship Satan? The answer is no. They openly worshipped Yahweh. But Jesus kept referring to his Father, as Paul referred to, quote, the Father. Who is this the Father? I think Yahweh maybe one time in the Old Testament is referred to as the Father. It's not a moniker he gets a lot. As it was translated into the Greek, Yahweh or Jehovah becomes Adonai, which means Lord. But Father is actually not a moniker he gets. So when Jesus is talking about his Father, and Paul talks about the Father, God the Father, and there's no significant predecessor within the Old Testament to identify this Father, I have to believe that the Father Jesus is talking about is like a Platonic monad. It's like in the Kabbalistic tree of life, it would be Keter, the crown, Ein Sof congealed into a singular monad. And that's where Jesus comes from. He is the humanification, the incarnation of that one monad. But that cuts Yahweh out of the picture entirely. Yahweh just becomes a competing archon. And that Jesus by his obedience becomes the slayer of archons. So, how do we know Jesus was a Gnostic? Well, who was Jesus' mentor? The answer is John the Baptist. Is John the Baptist a Gnostic? The answer is pretty strongly a yes. And most people don't understand this, but you can look this up. After John the Baptist's death, Jesus was not the successor of John the Baptist's movement. The successor to John the Baptist actually became Simon Magus. You can look that up. I barely believed it when I heard it, and then I looked it up. Simon Magus came to be the successor of the John the Baptist movement. And Simon Magus is absolutely a Gnostic. So why would a Gnostic be the successor to John the Baptist movement if John the Baptist himself were not a Gnostic? I believe John the Baptist was a Gnostic. But Jesus, in his association with John, and his being, at least initially, the student of John, leads me to believe that Jesus was also a Gnostic in the same vein. And look, I know people will say that Jesus was never John's student. Look, the lesser is always baptized by the greater, and we get some expedient for that in the New Testament that John gives protest. He says, I have need of baptism from you, and Jesus says, let it be so for now, for thus fulfilleth all righteousness. And I think that's just a little excuse thrown in there because they couldn't get around the fact that Jesus was in fact baptized by John, which would indicate a subordinate position for Christ. And I think that was the original arrangement, but I think that Jesus was a Gnostic in the same way that John was a Gnostic. And there's a Gnostic sect of Joanites still in the Middle East, and they worship John the Baptist, and they have very little love for Jesus. So there was an animosity there that's hard to explain. We certainly don't get that from the Gospels. There are theories. I won't expound them now. But basically, free thinking, loss of fear of judgment, and desiring a metaphysic that actually works led me to Gnosticism. And what made it all click was the fact that the Bible actually seems to teach it. So if there's any truth at all in the Bible, then Gnosticism is true. And then once you adopt that mindset, that metaphysic, you start to see evidence of it everywhere. The behaviors of the nations really make no sense unless they're being guided by some spiritual force. And so there is an archon which guides the United States. There is an archon which guides Iran. And for whatever reason, they've decided to fight. And so, as above, so below, the analog to that is our current conflict. And we're governed by these beings. We're governed more strongly the less you know they exist. And so the Gnostic seeks to understand so as to not be governed by these things, to be governed by a higher principle. So that's where I stand. I'm highly unorthodox, really a raging heretic, and I couldn't be less concerned about my soul at this point. Like I said, the God that cannot save also cannot damn. I don't think that the true God is particularly interested in damning me for what comparatively few faults I have that I've struggled my entire life against. I'm really just struggling against the human condition, as we all are. And if we can get away from this fear, and we can get away from all the judgment, and we simply strive to do best towards one another, I think we can overcome our overcome our situations, overcome our failures through knowledge and wisdom, rather than through the blind decrees of orthodoxy. So, if you want to add to that or to take issue with that, do so in the comments. I'll try to respond as I have time. I really want to get into writing again, and I probably won't have much opportunity for videos. So I would not expect these things to come very often, maybe once every month or two. Really want to get into writing because it's one of the only things you can do to guarantee your name or your memory will persist, for more than a generation after your demise. And if nobody else reads it, if I can simply pass it on through the family, that'll be fine with me. But really want to get back into writing. I have many other hobbies, many other interests, and YouTube simply cannot occupy too much of my time. So, thank you all for watching. I appreciate it. I'm sorry if this was a ramble. This was my spiritual biography. If you've experienced anything similar, let me know.